The scream tore through the canyon before Quinn Dalton could even dismount, a sound so raw and desperate it sent his horse dancing sideways in alarm. He had been tracking a wounded buck for the better part of an hour, but that cry changed everything. Quinn kicked his boots free of the stirrups and hit the ground running, his hand already reaching for the revolver at his hip. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Nevada territory as he pushed through the dense brush near Genoa, his heart hammering against his ribs. What he found on the other side of the juniper trees wasn't what he expected. A young woman knelt on the dusty ground, one hand pressed against her ankle, the other clutching a woven basket that had spilled its contents across the earth. Scattered around her were dozens of plants, their roots still clinging to bits of soil. Sage, yarrow, wild mint. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid and hung in waves around her shoulders, and her face was flushed from pain or heat or both. She looked up at his approach, her eyes wide and startled, a deep brown that reminded him of polished walnut. "Are you hurt?" Quinn asked, holstering his weapon and dropping to one knee beside her. "I twisted my ankle," she said through gritted teeth. "Stepped wrong on the rocks coming down from the ridge. It's nothing serious." But Quinn could see the way she held her weight off that foot, the slight tremor in her hands. "Let me take a look. I don't even know you." Her voice carried a note of suspicion, though pain softened the edges of it. "Quinn Dalton. I work the ranch west of town." He gestured vaguely in that direction. "And you're sitting in rattlesnake country with a bad ankle and no way to get home. So how about we skip the formalities and you let me help?" She studied him for a long moment, taking in his dusty boots, the weathered leather of his vest, the honest concern in his gray eyes. Finally, she nodded. "Julia Reeves. I live with my aunt near the main road." Quinn gently examined her ankle through the worn leather of her boot. It was already starting to swell. "You should get some cold water on this, ice if you can manage it." He looked at the scattered herbs, then back at her. "What were you doing all the way out here?" "Gathering plants for medicine." Julia reached for the basket, trying to collect what had spilled, but winced when the movement put pressure on her injury. "My aunt and I make remedies. People in town depend on us." "Well, they'll have to wait a day." Quinn stood and began gathering the plants himself, carefully placing each one back in the basket. He recognized some of them from his mother's teachings, years ago before she'd passed. The yarrow for wounds and fevers, the sage for digestion and cleansing, wild tobacco that the Washoe people used for ceremony and healing. "Let me help you carry these home." Julia opened her mouth to protest, but the pain in her ankle spoke louder than her pride. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Quinn finished collecting the last of the herbs and held out his free hand to her. "Come on. My horse can carry us both, and your place isn't more than 3 miles from here." She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong as he pulled her gently to her feet. Julia let out a sharp breath when she tried to put weight on her injured ankle, and Quinn immediately shifted, sliding his arm around her waist to support her. "Easy now," he said softly. "Just lean on me." They moved slowly through the brush, Quinn bearing most of her weight while carrying the basket of herbs in his other hand. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, waited patiently where he'd been left. Quinn helped Julia into the saddle first, then swung up behind her, settling the basket carefully in front of them. "Hold on," he murmured near her ear, and Julia felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. The ride to her aunt's house took nearly half an hour at the careful pace Quinn maintained. He kept one arm around Julia's waist to steady her, and she found herself acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the strength in the arm that held her, the gentle way he guided the horse around the roughest parts of the trail. "You said you work a ranch?" Julia asked, partly to distract herself from the throbbing in her ankle, and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had appeared out of nowhere to help her. "The Dalton place. My father started it 20 years ago, back in 1858 when this was still barely civilized territory. He passed 2 winters ago, left it to me and my brother." Quinn's voice carried the weight of old grief, but also something steadier. Acceptance, maybe. "We run cattle mostly, some horses. I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." Quinn was quiet for a moment. "What about you? Have you been in Genoa long?" 3 years. I came from Sacramento after my parents died of cholera. My Aunt Martha is the only family I have left. Julia adjusted the basket in her lap, her fingers moving restlessly among the plants. She taught me everything about herbs and healing. It's good work, honest work. Sounds like you care about it. I do. Julia turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of his profile. He had a strong jaw, sun-weathered skin, and lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. There's something powerful about knowing you can ease someone's suffering. Even if it's just a fever or a bad cough, it matters. It does, Quinn agreed, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. They emerged from the canyon trail onto the main road that ran through Genoa. The town sprawled ahead of them, a collection of wood frame buildings and false front stores that had grown up around the trading post and Mormon station. This was the oldest settlement in Nevada, established back when the territory was still part of Utah, and it bore the marks of its age. Some of the buildings were showing wear, their paint peeling under the relentless sun. Others were newer, built to accommodate the steady stream of settlers and prospectors still trickling through on their way to California or the silver mines around Virginia City. Julia's aunt lived in a small house at the eastern edge of town, a neat structure with a vegetable garden out front and rows of drying herbs hanging under the eaves. The moment Quinn brought Copper to a stop in the yard, the front door flew open and a woman in her 50s rushed out, her face tight with worry. "Julia? Where have you been? I was about to send someone looking for you." Aunt Martha stopped short when she saw Quinn helping Julia down from the horse. "What happened?" "Twisted my ankle up on the ridge," Julia said, wincing as her feet touched the ground. Quinn kept his arm around her, supporting her weight. "I'm fine, Aunt Martha. This is Quinn Dalton. He found me and brought me home." Martha's sharp eyes assessed Quinn in an instant, taking in everything from his worn but clean clothes to the respectful way he was handling her niece. "Well, come inside then, both of you. Let's get that ankle elevated and wrapped." Quinn helped Julia into the house and settled her on a worn sofa in the small parlor. The interior was tidy and smelled of dried lavender and peppermint. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and shelves along one wall held dozens of glass jars filled with leaves, roots, and powders. It was like stepping into an apothecary. Martha bustled around, heating water and gathering supplies. Quinn stood awkwardly near the door, suddenly aware that he was a stranger in their home, his presence an intrusion on their routine. "You can set the basket on the table," Julia called to him, noticing his discomfort. "And thank you. Really. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "You'd have figured something out," Quinn said, though they both knew it wasn't necessarily true. The canyon country was unforgiving, especially for someone injured and alone. He placed the basket where she had indicated, then moved back toward the door. "I should be getting back to the ranch. My brother will wonder where I've gotten to." "Wait." Martha appeared from the kitchen carrying a steaming bowl and clean cloths. "At least let me give you something for your trouble. Some salve for your horse, maybe? Or tea for aches." "That's not necessary, madam." "It is to me." Martha's tone left no room for argument. She set down her supplies and disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a small jar. "Arnica and comfrey, good for bruises and sore muscles. I imagine you get plenty of those working a ranch." Quinn accepted the jar, tucking it carefully into his vest pocket. "Thank you, madam. That's kind of you." He looked back at Julia one more time. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something soft and curious. "You take care of that ankle, Miss Reeves." "I will, Mr. Dalton." He nodded to both women and let himself out, swinging back up onto Copper and turning the horse toward home. As he rode away, Quinn found himself thinking about the way Julia's hair had caught the sunlight, the warmth in her brown eyes, the passion in her voice when she'd talked about her work. He shook his head, trying to clear it. He'd just met the woman. There was no sense getting tangled up in thoughts about her when he had a ranch to run and responsibilities to handle. But when he lay in bed that night, listening to the coyotes call across the range, it was Julia's face he saw in the darkness behind his eyelids. 3 days passed before Quinn found a reason to ride back into Genoa. He told himself he needed supplies from the general store, that it had nothing to do with wanting to check on a certain young woman with an injured ankle. But when he found himself steering Copper down the road toward the Reeves house instead of heading straight to the store, he couldn't pretend anymore. Julia was sitting on the front porch, her injured foot propped up on a small stool. She was sorting through dried plants, separating leaves from stems, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Mr. Dalton," she said, and he was pleased to hear a note of genuine welcome in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you again." Quinn dismounted and tied Copper to the porch rail. "I was in town for supplies. Thought I'd check on how you're healing." "That's kind of you." Julia gestured to a second chair on the porch. "Please sit. Aunt Martha is inside making tinctures, but I can call her if you'd like." "No need. I came to see you." Quinn caught himself. "That is, to see how you're doing." A smile played at the corners of Julia's mouth. "I'm doing well. The swelling has gone down considerably. Another few days and I should be able to walk normally again." "That's good news." Quinn settled into the chair, which creaked under his weight. "What are you working on?" "Chamomile. It needs to be completely dry before we store it. And I'm picking out any stems or debris." She held up a delicate flower head. "It makes excellent tea for anxiety and sleeplessness, also good for digestive complaints." "You really do know your plants." "My aunt is the true expert. I'm still learning." Julia set down the chamomile and studied him openly. "What about you? Did you ever find that buck you were tracking?" Quinn blinked in surprise. "How did you know I was tracking something?" "You had that focused look men get when they're hunting, and there was blood on your saddle blanket, not much but enough to suggest a wounded animal. You're observant." "I have to be. In my work, the difference between healing and harming sometimes comes down to tiny details. The color of a root, the smell of a leaf. You learn to pay attention." Julia tilted her head, regarding him with those warm brown eyes. "So did you find it?" "No," Quinn admitted. "After I heard you call out, the tracking kind of lost its importance. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cost you your hunt. Don't be. I'd make the same choice again." He meant it, and from the way Julia's expression softened, she knew he did. They talked for an hour, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Quinn learned that Julia was 22 years old, that she'd wanted to be a teacher before her parents died, that she missed the ocean even though she'd only seen it twice in her life. Julia learned that Quinn was 25, that he could play the guitar but rarely did anymore, that he dreamed of expanding the ranch someday to include sheep as well as cattle. Sheep? Julia laughed, the sound bright and musical. "I thought cattlemen and sheep herders were mortal enemies." "Only the stubborn ones. There's plenty of range for everyone if people would just learn to share." Quinn leaned back in his chair, more relaxed than he'd been in months. "Besides, sheep make sense. The wool is valuable, and they eat different grasses than cattle. It's good land management." "You've really thought this through. I have a lot of time to think when I'm out riding the range." He glanced at her. "It gets lonely sometimes." Julia's expression turned thoughtful. "I know what you mean. Even with Aunt Martha, sometimes I feel isolated. Most of the young people in town don't quite know what to make of me. The women think I'm odd for spending so much time learning about plants instead of looking for a husband. The men think I'm too educated for my own good." "Then they're fools," Quinn said bluntly. "There's nothing wrong with a woman having skills and knowledge. My mother could outride and outshoot most of the men in this territory, and my father loved her more for it." Julia's eyes widened slightly, then warmed. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was. She died when I was 19. Fever took her in 3 days." Quinn's voice roughened with old pain. "We tried everything. The doctor from Carson City, every remedy we knew. Nothing worked." Without thinking, Julia reached over and placed her hand on his. The gesture was simple, spontaneous, but it sent a jolt through Quinn that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with the soft warmth of her skin against his. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Losing a parent is terrible. Losing both is worse." They sat like that for a moment, hands touching, something unspoken passing between them. Then the front door opened and Aunt Martha stepped out, her eyebrows rising when she saw them. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "This is a surprise." Quinn stood quickly, suddenly aware of how it must look. "Madam, I was just checking on Julia's ankle." "How thoughtful." Martha's sharp eyes missed nothing, but her expression remained pleasant. "Will you stay for supper? It's the least we can do after you helped Julia the other day." Quinn knew he should decline. He'd already been here too long, and his brother would be expecting him back at the ranch. But when he looked at Julia, saw the hopeful expression on her face, he found himself saying, "I'd be honored, madam." Supper was a simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread, but it tasted better than anything Quinn had eaten in recent memory. Maybe it was the company, or maybe it was the way Julia kept glancing at him across the table, a slight smile playing on her lips. They talked about the town, about the growing tensions between settlers and the remaining Washoe people, about the constant stream of travelers passing through on their way to the silver mines. "It's changing everything," Martha said, shaking her head. "When I first came to Genoa 15 years ago, there were maybe 50 people here. Now it feels like 50 new faces arrive every week, some of them good people, some not so good." "The mines bring out the worst in some men," Quinn agreed. "All that silver makes people greedy, desperate." "Have you ever thought about trying your luck in Virginia City?" Julia asked. Quinn shook his head firmly. "I'm a rancher, not a miner. I like working with animals and land, not digging in the dark hoping to strike it rich. Besides, my father built something real with the ranch. I'm not about to abandon it chasing silver dreams." "That's admirable," Martha said, and Quinn could tell she meant it. Too many young men these days don't understand the value of steady work and building something lasting. By the time Quinn finally took his leave, the sun had set and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Julia walked him to the porch, leaning on a cane Martha had carved for her. "Thank you for staying," she said softly. "It was nice having someone new to talk to. Thank you for the meal and the company." Quinn untied Copper's reins, then hesitated. "I was thinking, maybe I could come by again, if that would be all right with you." Julia's smile was all the answer he needed, but she said it anyway. "I'd like that very much." Quinn rode home through the dark with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Copper seemed to sense his mood, moving with a spirited gait despite the long day. When Quinn finally reached the ranch and saw the lamp burning in the window of the main house, guilt pricked at him. His brother Thomas had probably handled all the evening chores alone. Sure enough, Thomas was waiting in the kitchen when Quinn came in. He was 3 years younger than Quinn, stockier in build with their father's red hair and their mother's green eyes. He looked up from the ledger he'd been working on and raised an eyebrow. "You're late. I was starting to think maybe that buck got the better of you. I went into town." Quinn hung his hat on the peg by the door and moved to the stove, where coffee still sat warming. "Checked on the woman who hurt her ankle the other day." "The herb gatherer?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, a knowing grin spreading across his face. "You stayed to check on her ankle, did you? That took 5 hours?" "I had supper with her and her aunt." Quinn poured coffee, avoiding his brother's eyes. "It was the polite thing to do." "Uh-huh." Thomas's grin widened. "What's her name?" Julia Reeves." "And is Miss Julia Reeves pretty?" Quinn thought about the way the lamplight had caught in Julia's hair during supper, the intelligence in her eyes, the graceful way her hands moved when she talked. "Yes," he said simply. "She is." Thomas laughed. "Well, it's about time. You've been moping around here like a lost calf ever since Father died. Maybe this woman will remind you there's more to life than work and worry." "I haven't been moping." "You have. You absolutely have." Thomas stood and clapped Quinn on the shoulder. "I'm glad you met her. When do I get to?" "I don't know yet. I've only seen her twice." "But you're planning to see her again." Quinn couldn't help but smile. "Yes, I am." Over the next 2 weeks, Quinn found excuses to ride into Genoa almost every other day. Sometimes he brought supplies Martha had requested, plants that grew near the ranch but were scarce closer to town. Sometimes he simply showed up with no excuse at all beyond wanting to see Julia. And see her he did, watching as her ankle healed and she regained her mobility, as she went back to gathering herbs with the same passion she'd shown that first day. On one visit, Julia offered to show him some of the plants she collected, and they spent an afternoon walking the hills above town while she pointed out different species and explained their uses. "This is mugwort," she said, kneeling to examine a silvery-leaved plant. "Good for women's complaints and for dreams. The Washoe people say it helps with visions." "Do you believe that?" Quinn asked, crouching beside her. I believe plants have properties we don't fully understand yet. Maybe some of those properties affect the mind and spirit as well as the body. Julia carefully harvested a few stems, adding them to her basket. The important thing is to approach it with respect. These plants are gifts. Quinn watched her work, admiring the gentle confidence in her movements. You should teach what you know. You'd make a good teacher after all. Julia glanced up at him, pleasure coloring her cheeks. Maybe someday. For now, I'm content learning from Aunt Martha and helping where I can. They moved on, climbing higher into the hills where juniper and sagebrush gave way to pine forest. The air was cooler here, scented with resin and mountain flowers. Quinn kept a watchful eye on Julia's ankle, but she moved confidently, showing no sign of pain. Does it bother you at all anymore? He asked. Hardly at all. Just a little stiffness in the morning. Julia paused to catch her breath, using the moment to look out over the valley below. Genoa spread out beneath them, small and neat, with the ranch lands stretching beyond toward the mountains. Is that your ranch? The one with the red barn? That's it, the Dalton place. Quinn moved to stand beside her, following her gaze. My father chose this land because of the water. We've got a creek that runs year-round, fed by snowmelt from the Sierra. It's good grazing country. It looks beautiful. Would you like to see it? The words came out before Quinn had fully thought them through. I could show you around, introduce you to Thomas, only if you want to, of course. Julia turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she smiled. I'd like that very much. They made the visit happen the following Saturday. Quinn arrived at the Reeves house with a small wagon instead of just copper, and he'd cleaned up more than usual, his hair still damp from washing, his best shirt pressed and tucked neatly into his trousers. Julia wore a blue dress that brought out the warmth in her eyes, and she'd braided her hair with ribbons that matched the fabric. You look lovely, Quinn said, and meant it. Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself. The drive to the ranch took 40 minutes, and they spent the time talking about everything and nothing. Julia told him about a difficult birth she and Martha had attended the week before, a breech baby that they'd managed to turn at the last moment, saving both mother and child. Quinn told her about a mountain lion that had been stalking their cattle and how he and Thomas had spent 3 nights taking turns on watch before finally scaring it off with warning shots. You didn't kill it? Julia asked. Didn't need to. The lion was just hungry, not evil. Once it understood we'd defend the herd, it moved on to easier prey. Quinn glanced at her. I don't kill anything unless I have to. For food or protection, yes, but not for sport or meanness. That's a good philosophy. When they arrived at the ranch, Thomas was waiting on the porch, clearly having taken as much care with his appearance as Quinn had. He bounded down the steps with a wide grin, pulling off his hat as he approached. You must be Miss Reeves, he said, offering his hand to help her down from the wagon. I'm Thomas. It's a pleasure to meet you. Quinn hasn't stopped talking about you. Thomas, Quinn growled in warning, but Julia just laughed. It's nice to meet you too, Thomas, and please call me Julia. Thomas gave Quinn a look that said, I like her already, then stepped back. Come on, I'll give you the grand tour. We're not fancy, but we work hard. The Dalton ranch was modest but well maintained. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The barn was indeed painted red, weathered by time but solid. Beyond that were corrals, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and various outbuildings for equipment and supplies. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, their coats glossy and healthy in the September sun. Julia took it all in with genuine interest, asking questions about the operation and listening carefully to the answers. Quinn showed her the vegetable garden his mother had started, now somewhat overgrown but still producing. He showed her the creek and the irrigation channels his father had dug. He showed her the horses in the stable, including Copper, who nuzzled at Julia's palm looking for treats. He likes you, Quinn observed. I like him too, Julia stroked the gelding's neck. He has kind eyes. Thomas had prepared a meal for them, simple but hearty, and they ate on the porch while the afternoon sun slanted golden across the yard. The conversation flowed easily, Thomas's natural exuberance balancing Quinn's quieter nature, and Julia holding her own between them with quick wit and genuine interest in their lives. So, what made you become a healer? Thomas asked, refilling Julia's glass with cold tea. Necessity at first, Julia admitted. When I came to live with Aunt Martha, I was grieving and lost. She gave me purpose by teaching me her craft. But it became more than that. There's something deeply satisfying about easing suffering, about taking something from nature and using it to help someone in pain. Do you ever worry about making a mistake? Thomas asked, using the wrong plant or the wrong amount? Every day. That's why we're so careful. We test everything, keep meticulous records, and we never guess. If we're not absolutely certain, we tell people to see a doctor. Julia's expression grew serious. But doctors aren't always available out here, and sometimes people can't afford them. That's where we come in. Quinn had been quiet, just listening and watching Julia talk, but now he leaned forward. You said you wanted to be a teacher before. Do you ever regret not pursuing that? Julia considered the question carefully. Sometimes. I think I would have enjoyed it. But teaching and healing aren't so different, really. Both require patience and the ability to meet people where they are. And I do teach in a way. I'm teaching anyone who will listen about the plants around them, about how to take care of themselves. That's a good way to look at it, Quinn said softly. As the afternoon wore into evening, Thomas excused himself with a wink at Quinn, claiming he had chores to finish. Quinn and Julia found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I had a wonderful time today, Julia said. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad you came. Quinn shifted in his chair, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been all day. Julia, I need to tell you something. She turned to look at him, her expression open and curious. What is it? I've been thinking about you constantly since the day we met. You're intelligent and passionate and beautiful, and when I'm with you, I feel like maybe the future isn't just about work and responsibility. Like maybe there's room for happiness too. The words tumbled out faster than Quinn intended. I know we haven't known each other long, but I'd like to court you properly, if you'd be willing. Julia's eyes had gone wide, but there was no surprise in them, only warmth. Quinn Dalton, I thought you'd never ask. Yes, I'd be very willing. Relief and joy flooded through Quinn in equal measure. He reached for Julia's hand, threading his fingers through hers, and they sat like that as the stars began to emerge overhead, neither of them needing to say anything more. The courtship that followed was everything it should be. Quinn rode into Genoa twice a week, always bringing some small gift. Wildflowers he'd picked on the range, a book he thought Julia might enjoy, a fox pelt that Martha could use for trim. Julia welcomed him each time with a smile that made his heart skip, and they spent hours talking, walking, learning each other. Martha watched their growing attachment with approval. She'd seen enough of life to recognize genuine feeling when she witnessed it, and there was no mistaking the way her niece and Quinn Dalton looked at each other. Still, she kept a careful eye, making sure propriety was observed, that Julia's reputation remained unblemished. One evening in early October, when the aspens were turning gold and the air carried a hint of coming winter, Quinn invited Julia to a dance in town. It was an annual event, held in the large barn behind the trading post, and half the territory seemed to turn out for it. Quinn wore his only suit, brushed and pressed, and his heart nearly stopped when Julia emerged from her house in a green dress that made her look like some kind of forest spirit. You're staring, she said, but she was smiling. Can't help it. You're the prettiest woman in Nevada. Flatterer. But she tucked her hand into his arm, pleased. The barn was packed with people, the air warm despite the cool evening outside. A makeshift band played fiddle and guitar, and couples whirled across the floor in various stages of grace and enthusiasm. Quinn led Julia into the dance, and they moved together with an ease that suggested they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. You're a good dancer, Julia said, slightly breathless as Quinn spun her. My mother insisted Thomas and I learn. She said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized. Julia laughed, the sound swallowed by the music. They danced 3 songs before taking a break, standing outside in the cool air to catch their breath. Other couples moved around them, and Julia noticed more than a few curious glances cast their way. I think people are talking about us, she murmured. Let them talk. Quinn found her hand in the darkness, squeezed gently. I don't care what they say. Neither do I. Julia leaned into him slightly, close enough that he could smell the lavender water she used in her hair. Quinn, I need to tell you something. What is it? I'm falling in love with you. I think I started that first day when you offered to help carry my herbs home, but I'm sure of it now. Quinn's breath caught. He turned to face her fully, cupping her face in his hands. Julia Reeves, I fell for you the moment I saw you sitting there in the dust, stubborn and hurt, and still thinking about your work before yourself. I love you. God help me. I love you. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. Julia melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to just the two of them. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. We should probably go back inside, Julia said reluctantly, before Aunt Martha sends out a search party. Probably. But Quinn didn't move, and neither did she. They went back inside eventually, dancing until the band packed up and people began drifting home. Quinn drove Julia back to her house, and they sat in the wagon outside for another half hour, talking and stealing kisses until Martha's lamp appeared in the window, a gentle reminder that it was late and Julia should come in. When can I see you again? Quinn asked. Tomorrow? Is tomorrow too soon? Tomorrow's perfect. The next months passed in a blur of happiness. Quinn and Julia spent every free moment together, and their love deepened with each passing day. They talked about the future in careful, hopeful terms, about expanding the ranch, about Julia continuing her work with plants and medicine, about building a life together that honored both their dreams. In December, when the first real snow fell on Genoa, Quinn came calling with his brother in tow. Thomas wore his best clothes and carried a bottle of wine, and both men looked nervous. Martha answered the door, took one look at them, and called for Julia with a knowing smile. Quinn asked Martha's permission first, as was proper, explaining his intentions and his ability to provide for a wife. Martha listened carefully, asked pointed questions about the ranch's finances and Quinn's character, then finally nodded her approval. Only then did Quinn turn to Julia, who had been waiting with barely contained anticipation. He dropped to one knee right there in the small parlor, pulling out a ring his mother had worn. It was simple, a slim gold band with a small ruby, but it had been cherished. Julia Reeves, you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. You're brilliant and kind, and you make me want to be a better man. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling so wide it looked like her face might split. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Quinn slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, and Thomas let out a whoop of celebration while Martha wiped at her own eyes, pretending she had something in them. They set the wedding for late February, giving them time to prepare, but not so long that the waiting became unbearable. Julia sewed her own dress, ivory linen with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Martha added embroidery in the shape of wildflowers and healing herbs. Quinn and Thomas worked on adding 2 rooms to the ranch house, expanding it to accommodate a growing family. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter morning where everything seems sharp and bright. The ceremony took place in the small church in Genoa, with half the town in attendance. Julia walked down the aisle on Martha's arm, and the look on Quinn's face when he saw her was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Pure love, pure joy, pure certainty. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to honor and cherish each other through whatever came. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed Julia with a tenderness that made more than a few women in the audience sigh. The reception was held at the trading post, tables laden with food and drink that people had contributed. There was music and dancing and laughter, and when Quinn and Julia finally left in the wagon to head back to the ranch, they were showered with rice and good wishes. Mrs. Dalton, Quinn said as they drove through the darkness. Julia nestled against his side under a heavy blanket. How does that sound? Perfect. It sounds perfect. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous but eager, and the love between them made everything feel right. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Quinn's bed, now their bed, and talked until the early hours of morning. Are you happy? Quinn asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Julia's shoulder. Happier than I ever thought possible. She tilted her head to kiss his jaw. Are you? I am. I really am. Life on the ranch suited Julia better than she'd expected. She missed Martha, who had chosen to stay in town, but she visited twice a week and Martha came for Sunday dinners. Julia established her own garden for medicinal plants, carefully cultivating the ones she used most often. People learned that the Dalton Ranch was a place they could come for remedies and advice, and Julia was never too busy to help. Quinn thrived with Julia by his side. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Julia had a good head for figures and helped Quinn reorganize their record-keeping, making it easier to track expenses and profits. Thomas joked that he'd been completely replaced, but he didn't really mean it. He loved seeing his brother so happy, loved having Julia as a sister. In the spring, Julia realized she was pregnant. She told Quinn one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, careful not to squeeze too hard, his face alight with joy and wonder. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby. In November, if my calculations are right. November, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect." Quinn became almost comically protective during Julia's pregnancy, fussing over her constantly, insisting she not overdo things. Julia tolerated it with good humor, knowing it came from love, but she also made it clear she wasn't made of glass. She continued her work with herbs and healing right up until the last month, when her belly grew too large to be comfortable bending and reaching. Martha came to stay at the ranch 2 weeks before Julia's due date, and her presence eased everyone's nerves. She delivered dozens of babies over the years and knew exactly what to do. When Julia's labor started on a cold November evening, Martha took charge with calm efficiency. Quinn was beside himself with worry, pacing the parlor while Thomas tried to distract him with cards and whiskey. They could hear Julia's cries from upstairs, and each one made Quinn flinch. "She's strong," Thomas kept saying. "She'll be fine. They'll both be fine." And they were. After 8 hours of labor, Julia delivered a healthy baby boy with Quinn's gray eyes and a surprising amount of dark hair. Martha cleaned the infant and wrapped him in soft blankets, then placed him in Quinn's shaking arms while she tended to Julia. "You have a son," Martha told him, her voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful, perfect son." Quinn looked down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers already gripping at his shirt, and felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your father." They named him James, after Quinn's father, and he was immediately adored by everyone who met him. Thomas declared himself the best uncle in Nevada and took his duties very seriously, carving toys and teaching his nephew to laugh. Martha visited weekly, doting on her great-nephew and helping Julia navigate the challenges of new motherhood. Julia discovered she had a natural instinct for mothering, just as she did for healing. She was patient and attentive, and somehow managed to balance caring for James with maintaining her herb work and helping Quinn with the ranch. It wasn't always easy, but it was deeply fulfilling. When James was 6 months old, toddling around on unsteady legs and getting into everything, Quinn came home one day with news. "I've been talking to some of the other ranchers," he told Julia over supper, "about forming a cooperative. We could share resources, negotiate better prices for our cattle, help each other during hard times. What do you think?" Julia considered it carefully. "I think it's a good idea. The more connected people are, the stronger the community becomes. Is Thomas on board?" "He is. We'd still run our own operations, but we'd have the security of knowing we're not alone if something goes wrong." "Then you should do it." The cooperative took months to organize, but it proved to be exactly the kind of practical innovation the ranching community needed. By pooling resources and information, the ranchers could weather market fluctuations and natural disasters more effectively. Quinn found himself something of a leader among them, his steady nature and fair dealing earning respect from men twice his age. Julia continued her healing work, and her reputation grew. People came from as far as Carson City to consult with her about difficult cases. She never charged more than people could afford, often accepting payment in goods or services instead of money. It wasn't about profit for her. It was about helping. In the summer of James's 2nd year, tragedy struck when a fire broke out in one of the outbuildings. Quinn and Thomas managed to contain it before it spread to the main house or barn, but Thomas was badly burned on his arms and chest trying to save some trapped horses. Julia's training kicked in immediately. She treated Thomas's burns with aloe and honey, wrapped them carefully, and watched for signs of infection. For 3 days, Thomas hovered between fever and lucidity while Julia and Martha tended him around the clock. Quinn felt helpless, watching his brother suffer, knowing there was nothing he could do. Julia found him one night sitting beside Thomas's bed, head in his hands. "He's going to be okay," she said softly, coming to stand behind him. "The fever's breaking, I'm sure of it." "What if it doesn't? What if I lose him too?" "You won't." Julia wrapped her arms around Quinn's shoulders. "He's strong, and we're taking good care of him. Have faith." She was right. Thomas turned the corner that night, waking the next morning clear-eyed and asking for breakfast. His recovery was slow, the burns healing into scars he would carry the rest of his life. But he survived. And when he was well enough to talk about it, he credited Julia entirely. "You saved my life," he told her seriously. "I won't forget that." "Family takes care of family," Julia replied simply. Life settled back into its rhythms. James grew from a toddler into a curious, energetic little boy who followed his father everywhere and peppered his mother with endless questions about the plants in her garden. Julia found herself pregnant again, and this time when the baby came, it was a girl. They named her Margaret, after Quinn's mother, and called her Maggie. Quinn held his daughter for the first time and felt the same overwhelming love he'd felt with James, but colored differently. This tiny girl was going to need his protection, his guidance. She was going to change the world, he could already tell. She had her mother's eyes and determination even as a newborn. "2 children," Julia mused, watching Quinn with Maggie. "We're building quite a family." "Is that all right with you?" Quinn asked, looking up at her. "It's more than all right. It's everything." The years that followed were good ones. Hard work, certainly, with challenges and setbacks like any life in the frontier, but good. The ranch prospered. James and Maggie grew healthy and happy. Julia's herb garden expanded to include dozens of species, and she began keeping careful written records of her knowledge, thinking perhaps one day she might publish it for others to learn from. Quinn never lost his wonder at the life they had built together. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of his work, look around at the ranch, at his children playing in the yard, at Julia tending her plants, and feel almost overwhelmed with gratitude. This was what happiness looked like. This was what his father had built toward, what his mother had hoped for her sons. When Thomas married a schoolteacher named Elizabeth, who moved to Genoa from California, the Dalton family celebrations became even livelier. Elizabeth was practical and funny, and she fit into their lives like she'd always been meant to be there. She and Julia became close friends, and when Elizabeth had her own children, the cousins grew up together like siblings. On James's 10th birthday, Quinn gave him his first real responsibility on the ranch, a calf to raise and care for himself. The boy took to it with the same dedication he showed everything, and Quinn saw himself in his son's serious expression, his careful attention to the animal's needs. "You're a natural rancher," Quinn told him one evening as they finished the chores together. "I want to be just like you, Papa," James said, and Quinn had to turn away to hide the emotion on his face. Maggie, at 8 years old, showed no interest in ranching, but was fascinated by her mother's work. She had already memorized the names and uses of a dozen plants, and Julia often found her daughter in the garden, carefully examining leaves and roots. "She has the gift," Martha observed during one of her visits, "just like you did at that age." "I think you're right," Julia agreed, watching Maggie sketch a plant in a small journal Quinn had given her. "I hope she chooses to use it. She will. It's in her blood." Life wasn't without its challenges. There were dry years when the creek ran low, and they had to make hard decisions about the herd. There were winters so cold and harsh that simply surviving felt like an accomplishment. There was the time measles swept through Genoa, and Julia worked herself to exhaustion caring for the sick. There was the year bandits targeted several ranches, and Quinn and the other men had to organize patrols to keep their families safe. But through it all, Quinn and Julia had each other. Their love had deepened and matured, growing from that first spark of attraction into something solid and enduring. They knew each other's moods and thoughts, could communicate with a look across a crowded room. They argued sometimes about money or decisions or how to handle the children, but they always talked it through, always came back to the fundamental respect and affection that had drawn them together. On their 10th anniversary, Quinn surprised Julia with a trip to Virginia City. Thomas and Elizabeth agreed to watch the children, And for 3 days, Quinn and Julia were just a couple again, not parents or ranchers or healers. They stayed in a hotel with real wallpaper, ate in restaurants, and danced in a proper ballroom. "Thank you for this," Julia said as they swayed to the music. "I didn't realize how much I needed a break." We both did. I love our life, but sometimes it's good to remember we're more than just our responsibilities. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me? Taking on a family so young?" Quinn pulled back to look at her, his expression incredulous. "Regret it? Julia, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. You and the children, you're everything. How could I regret that?" "I just wanted to make sure. Sometimes I worry I've taken over your whole life." "You have, but in the best possible way." Quinn kissed her forehead. "I love you. I will always love you." As the children grew, the nature of ranch life evolved. James became Quinn's right hand, capable and trustworthy, learning every aspect of the operation. Maggie continued her studies with Julia and Martha, and by the time she was 14, she was making her own remedies and treating minor ailments on her own. Quinn sometimes thought about that day he'd found Julia gathering herbs in the canyon, how he'd had no idea that simple act of kindness would change his entire life. He'd been tracking a wounded buck and ended up finding something far more valuable. A partner, a love, a future. Thomas, watching his brother watch Julia one evening during a family dinner, smiled to himself. Some people spent their whole lives searching for what Quinn and Julia had found. He was glad his brother had been smart enough to recognize it and hold on to it. "You're staring at her again," Thomas murmured. "Am I?" Quinn didn't look away. "You always do, even after all these years." "Can't help it. She's still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." "You're hopeless." "Happily so." When Martha passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 73, Julia grieved deeply, but also felt a sense of peace. Her aunt had lived a full life, had taught Julia everything she knew, and had gotten to see her niece happy and settled with a family. At the funeral, Julia spoke about Martha's legacy, about all the people she'd helped over the decades, about the knowledge she'd passed on that would continue to heal and help long after she was gone. "She taught me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken," Julia said, her voice steady despite her tears. "It's about compassion and attention. It's about seeing people as whole human beings, not just symptoms. That's what I hope to pass on to my daughter and to anyone else who'll listen." Maggie stood beside her mother, 16 years old, and already showing signs of the remarkable healer she would become. She squeezed Julia's hand, silently promising to carry on the tradition. As the years continued their steady march, Quinn began thinking more about the future and less about the present. James was 21 now, fully capable of running the ranch on his own. Maggie was 19, splitting her time between helping her mother and studying with a doctor in Carson City who recognized her talent. The ranch was prosperous and stable, built on a foundation solid enough to last generations. "I think it's time to start stepping back," Quinn told Julia one night as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. "Let James take more control. We've done our part. Maybe now we get to just enjoy what we built." "Are you saying you want to retire?" Julia teased. "Not completely, but maybe ease up a bit, spend more time with you, maybe travel a little if you'd like." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'd like that very much. Where would we go?" "Anywhere you want. We could visit the ocean since you said you miss it. We could go to San Francisco, see the city, or we could just stay here and enjoy not having to work from dawn to dusk. Let's do all of it. Let's enjoy every moment we have left." They did just that. Over the next several years, Quinn and Julia gradually handed over the daily operations of the ranch to James and his new wife. They took trips to places Julia had only dreamed of. They spent long afternoons in the garden, just talking and being together. They watched with pride as Maggie established her own practice, becoming known throughout the territory as one of the best healers available. Quinn's hair turned gray, then white. Julia developed lines around her eyes from years of squinting in the sun and smiling. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love in a canyon outside Genoa, connected by herbs and happenstance and something deeper than either could name. On their 40th anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Quinn raised a glass to Julia. 40 years ago, I was tracking a wounded buck and instead found the love of my life. I heard a scream, went to help, and found a stubborn woman with a twisted ankle and a basket full of plants. I said, "Let me help you carry those home." And she let me. Best decision either of us ever made. I knew the moment he offered to help that he was special, Julia added, her voice warm with memory. He didn't have to stop. He didn't have to care. But he did. And that kindness led to all of this. She gestured around the table at their family. Our children, our grandchildren, our life. It all started because one cowboy chose to help a woman he didn't know. Best choice I ever made, Quinn said again, and he leaned over to kiss her, not caring that their grandchildren were giggling. Life eventually slowed, as it does for everyone. Quinn's joints ached on cold mornings. Julia's eyesight weakened, though her mind stayed sharp. They spent more time sitting and less time doing, but they were content. They had lived full lives, loved deeply, built something lasting. What more could anyone ask for? On a spring morning when Quinn was 71 and Julia was 68, they took a slow walk through the herb garden Julia had maintained for nearly 40 years. The plants were thriving, tended now mostly by Maggie and her daughter, but Julia still liked to visit them, to remember all the people she'd helped with these leaves and roots and flowers. "Do you ever think about that day?" Quinn asked, his hand steady in hers despite the tremor that sometimes affected it. "The day we met? All the time. It changed everything." "It did. One moment I was alone, the next I'd found you. Like fate. Or just good fortune." Julia smiled up at him. "Either way, I'm grateful. So am I, love, so am I." They stood there in the garden, surrounded by the plants that had brought them together, in the shadow of the mountains that had watched over their whole life together, and everything felt complete. They had loved and been loved. They had built and created and nurtured. They had taken a chance on each other 4 decades ago, and it had paid off beyond either's wildest dreams. That evening, sitting on the porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching another sunset paint the Nevada sky in impossible colors, Quinn turned to Julia and said the same thing he'd said on their wedding night and every anniversary since. "I love you, Mrs. Dalton. And I love you, Mr. Dalton. Always and forever." Their hands clasped together, fingers intertwined, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight they had this moment, this peace, this perfect contentment that came from a life well lived and a love well tended. James found them there later, asleep in their chairs, still holding hands. He smiled and draped blankets over them rather than wake them, knowing how much they treasured these quiet evenings together. In the morning, they would wake and begin another day. But for now, they rested in the gathering darkness, 2 people who had found each other against the odds and held on tight through everything life threw at them. The herb garden grew wild with the changing seasons, but it was never abandoned. Maggie and her children tended it faithfully, honoring Julia's legacy. The ranch prospered under James's management, and eventually his sons after him. The Dalton name became synonymous with hard work, fair dealing, and community spirit in the region. And always, in the family stories passed down through generations, there was the tale of how it all began. How Quinn had been tracking a wounded buck and heard a scream. How he'd found Julia with a twisted ankle and a basket of herbs. How he'd offered to help carry them home, and she'd said yes. How that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that sustained not just 2 people, but an entire family and community. When Quinn passed away at 76, peaceful in his sleep with Julia beside him, the whole territory mourned. He'd been a good man, a loving husband, a devoted father. He'd built something lasting and treated everyone with respect and fairness. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched in one way or another. Julia lived 2 more years, her mind sharp until the end despite her body's increasing frailty. She spent those years writing down everything she knew about healing plants, creating a comprehensive guide that Maggie eventually published. It became a standard reference for healers throughout the West, used for decades by people who never knew Julia but benefited from her knowledge and experience. On a warm September evening, Julia sat in her room surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She'd been growing weaker all day, and everyone knew the end was near. But Julia wasn't afraid. She'd lived 81 years, most of them happy, all of them meaningful. She'd loved and been loved. She'd helped countless people. She'd raised good children who had children of their own. She'd done what she set out to do. "Tell me again," she whispered to James, who sat holding her hand, "about the day your father and I met." James smiled through his tears and told the story one more time. About the canyon and the herbs and the twisted ankle. About a cowboy who stopped to help a stranger. About two people who found each other and chose each other and built a beautiful life together. Julia listened with her eyes closed, smiling. She could see it all so clearly. Quinn's face when he'd first appeared through the juniper trees, the kindness in his eyes when he'd said, "Let me help you carry those home." The way her heart had skipped, even then, sensing that something important was beginning. "He was a good man," she murmured. "The best," James agreed, "and you were perfect for each other." "We were." Julia's breathing was slowing now, becoming peaceful. "Tell him I'm coming. Tell him I'll see him soon." "We will, Mama. We will." Julia Dalton passed away quietly that evening, surrounded by love, her last thoughts of Quinn and the life they'd shared. They buried her beside him in the cemetery overlooking the ranch, under a headstone that read, "Beloved wife, mother, and healer." The ranch continued for generations, the Dalton family growing and spreading but always remembering their roots. The herb garden remained, tended lovingly, a living memorial to the woman who had planted it and the knowledge she'd shared so freely. And always, the story was told of how it began, that afternoon in the canyon, when a cowboy found a woman gathering herbs and offered to help carry them home, never imagining that simple gesture would change both their lives forever and create a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.